Rewind time to the mid.
Sorry, can I move this table back about 6 inches? A little too close.
Back one slide, there you go.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the April meeting of the Scottsdale Civil War Roundtable. I'm Dick Cox. I'm Vice President. Mark Stoller, our President, is on vacation and can't be with us tonight, but will be here next month. Before we start our program, I just have a couple of announcements before turning it over to John Taylor. First of all, we haven't done a grape shot yet this month. We've been waiting to get it out until the board has met to approve the donations, preservation donations for this season. As you know, a big part of what we do at the roundtable, besides bringing in interesting speakers on lots of topics, is give a portion of your dues to preserve various battlefields around the active sites in both the Eastern and Western theaters. So we will be doing that at our board meeting toward the end of the month. Once that is done, we will then make an announcement as to what those donations, where that money has gone to. The second thing is, you probably know already, but we have to keep emphasizing this, and that is that this facility will not be available to us next season, particularly from September through December. Our meetings instead are going to be at the Mustang Library, which is just off the 101 and Shea Boulevard. And it's a facility about this size. The auditorium is a little smaller, but we're sure we can make it work. We're going to be there, as I say, from September, probably through December, and who knows, maybe longer. But once this facility has been remodeled, we will be back here, and we will let you know. We will keep reminding you between now and September that we will be meeting at the Mustang Library instead of this facility. The other thing is we want to acknowledge all our members, but particularly since we have 30 new members this year. Are any of your new members present today? If so, please stand and be recognized. Thank you very much. Also, we sometimes need help with some of our technical issues, particularly our YouTube feed. Our YouTube feed goes out to a number of members who can't be here personally and also around the country and even around the world. So our YouTube expert sometimes has trouble making the meetings on time. He has a job, and if anybody has some YouTube expertise, some technical expertise, please let Tom Merrill, who is our YouTube specialist, please let him know that. Well, that's really all we have for tonight. I'm now going to turn it over to John Taylor, who is our program chairman, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening, everybody. I don't know what it is about people from Pennsylvania, but they're fascinated by the far, far west in the Civil War. I wanted to briefly note to you that our friends at Emerging Civil War have just put out a new book, authored primarily by a guy named Patrick Kelly Fisher, who's going to be coming out to speak to us in 2 years and on the subject of the New Mexico campaign. So our speaker tonight did not author a book on New Mexico, but if anybody's interested in studying the campaign a little more, there is a new book by Chris Makowski and his group at Emerging Civil War. Our speaker tonight is also from Pennsylvania, as is the author of this book. Lynn Herman and his wife, Julianne Herman, are fascinated by the Civil War in the far, far West, as well as other obscure topics like Civil War Florida. Lynn is a former House rep in the state of Pennsylvania, representing the area around State College, and is also a past president and very involved with the State College Civil War Roundtable. And so we'll forgive him for being a Penn State fan. But anyway, without further ado, we're very excited to have Lynn come up and talk to us about the Civil War in New Mexico. Put your hands together for Lynn Herman.
Thank you for that introduction. One correction is that I am president of the State College Civil War Roundtable, not past. And my wife is still secretary of this Civil War Roundtable too. And like most of us who are presidents of this and that of age, you just can't get rid of it. I've been trying to get rid of the presidency for years and find out that even at 69 years old, I'm still one of the younger members. So anyway, three rules. All right, let's look at our phones and put them on silent or turn them off so we don't get that embarrassing telephone ring during this presentation. Rule number 2 is that I will try to speak loudly, but if I'm not speaking loud enough, please yell out, speak louder, or if I'm talking too softly, then say I'm too loud. And we have a gadget here to turn the microphone up and down. And rule number 3 is, rule number 3 is this. I'm supposed to answer questions and answers at the end of the program, but if you have questions, yell out question. I'll stop right there. Let's address the kind of question while it's still fresh in your mind and mine and see if I can address that. So at any rate, like you, I'm president of our Central Pennsylvania Civil War Roundtable, and like many of you in your group, you get the great authors of the books, like we just heard from Mr. Taylor, and also the great Civil War battlefield guides and the authors, and all the great ones who've done all the research. And my wife, Julie, and I are none of that. We're travelers. We vacation a lot. And I've been out here for 2 weeks already studying, doing the kid in New Mexico, but also took the opportunity to go to some of the Civil War sites of this program that I had not been to before and take better pictures or get some pictures. And you're not going to see those pictures because they were just taken this past week, but we're going to upgrade my program and so forth. So at any rate, I had heard or had read in Shelby Foote's trilogy of the Civil War, Fort Sumter to Appomattox. He only devotes 2 or 3 pages to the New Mexico campaign. But I had a conference, a legislative conference in Santa Fe 20 years ago. And I said to my wife, I want to go do a study of some of this campaign. Let's go down to Val Verde and start there and march up to Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and over to Glorieta. So some of these pictures we're going to see are some of these are our pictures. So at this time, I can introduce my wife, Joanne, for just a brief 30-second description of how she got involved with this with me. And she's my partner in marriage as well as in Civil War activities.
So Lynn wanted to come out here and do the Battle of Glorietta Pass, and we both read Don Albert's book, The Battle of Glorietta, and he said, he said to me, why don't you try to get hold of this guy and see if he'll give us a tour? So I don't remember how I did it anymore. I was able to contact him, and he said, I've been trying to put together a tour, people that asked me about it, because when I wrote my book, I was able to, because I wrote the book, people met me and they knew I was interested. They let me go on parts of the battlefield that were totally private land, places that were closed off to the public. And he said, I'm going to give a tour where you're going to get to see parts of the battlefield that nobody gets to see. So Don did this tour for us. I think now some of the battle places on the battlefield have opened up a little bit more. We went through, we saw some hiking trails, but I still think there's lots of places that are private land, so we feel very blessed that Don gave us that tour. So you'll see some of our photos that we took on that tour. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Joanne. And like I said, tonight's program is the Glorietta Pass, the New Mexico campaign, Battle of Glorietta, the Gettysburg of the West. Now, how many of you have never been to Gettysburg in my home state? Never been? A couple? Okay. We'll get you there someday, but please come. At any rate, I guess I'm curious as the people of Glorietta actually refer to themselves as the Gettysburg of the West, as do many historians. So as we conclude the program tonight, I think the biggest question is this an exaggeration, or is it a fair, not a contract, but a fair evaluation of the Mexico campaign? So, at any rate, Like I said, Joanne said, we got our program is basically from Shelby Foote's trilogy of the Civil War from Fort Sumter to Appomattox. It's a combination of John Albert's book, a combination of our research. And the pictures you're going to see are from the internet. And they're also pictures that we took ourselves that you can't have or can't get, because one of those things we had to do this tour we have with John Albert's was on private land. Secondly, after 20 years, there's overgrowth. We were there at Glorietta Pass last week, and you can already see a Pigeon Ranch or Sharpshooter's Bridge anymore, as the growth of the trees and shrubs has taken over. So we're very blessed to have some of these. So you're going to see some pictures that you cannot see or won't see from that guy's book. Okay, so let's get on with it. Joanne, want to send the next picture? So Abraham Lincoln's election to the presidency, some would argue, forced the secession of the Deep South states, including Texas. Lincoln and the new Republican Party had taken a hardline stance against the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Across the South, including the farms and the pastures of Texas, these Americans argued that the abolitionists had sundered the nation, ignoring the constitutional rights to property and abandoning the manifest destiny of the nation to expand. Many Southerners believed that the Yankees were jealous of their new influence in national affairs, were trying every scheme possible to subvert prosperity and power of an increasingly affluent Southern South. For Americans in 1861, interest in places such as California, New Mexico, Colorado, and Texas outshone the settled portions of the East, the West with the nation's future, the East, the nation's past. South and west of Texas, the territories of Utah and New Mexico stretch on beyond the sunset to California, Nevada, and the Colorado gold and silver fields and the Pacific. In the minds of most, this half-baked, half-million square mile wasteland with its brackish lakes and its few thirsty rivers were of little value, fit only as a breeding ground of lizards and Apaches. Others knew better. Jefferson Davis was one of these. He believed in his Union days as Secretary of War that the nation's destiny pointed south and west. He engineered the Gadsden Purchase, which incidentally was signed in Wasilla, New Mexico, we learned last week, and even imported camels in an attempt to solve the sandy transportation problems. Now, as the Confederate president, his belief was that control of the gold fields and the ocean would establish sound financial credit on which the South could draw for securing war supplies abroad while opening up Confederate seaports along the Pacific coast that would ensure their delivery by stretching the tenuous federal blockade past the snapping point. Do you have a question? Do you have a question?
No, he doesn't.
Oh, he's just stretching? Okay. The new Confederate nation could then return to the old Southern nationalist dream of expansion, acquired by purchase or conquest the adjoining states of Chihuahua, Sonora, and Baja California. After these, possibly others, such as Cuba and Central America. None of this could be accomplished until safe passage west had been assured by clearing federal troops for the territory in New Mexico. The answer to this lay in the control of the Rio Grande River. It would be with considerable pleasure that President Davis was welcomed to Richmond 2 months after Fort Sumter had fallen. A 42-year-old Louisiana-born West Pointer, the former U.S. Army Major Henry Hopkins Sibley. Henry Sibley had come to offer his services. He was the enterprising United States officer inventing a conical tent, the Sibley tent, while after the wigwams on Sioux and the Sibley stove. Now, I'm a Civil War reenactor. I talked to many of you who are reenactors. Only one time was I a reenactor that I ever saw a Sibley tent on the Civil War battlefield, and I've never seen a Sibley stove. Well, this picture, go back one more. The Sibley stove. I had never seen one until 2 years ago. We did a Civil War program back to back in Milwaukee and Chicago, and the officers in Milwaukee said, you got to stop at the Kenosha Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Illinois. And they had a Sibley stove on display. I had never ever seen one, and you're the first Civil War Roundtable group to see it in this slide too. Incidentally, like I said, we've been out of touristing for the last 2 weeks, but we also saw a Civil War Sibley stove on exhibit at Fort Selden and also one at one at the Billy the Kid Museum in Fort Sumner. They had one on display. Sibley is described as a stocky, windburnt man with a big featured face, a heavy mustache that grew down past the corners of his mouth. Davis might have been listening to his own thoughts, as Sibley described the possibility of victory by way of California. Granted the authorities, Sibley said he would take a mounted force in Texas south northward from El Paso, live off the land once in New Mexico, capture the force along the way to Santa Fe. This done, he would then consolidate and march north to recapture the rich mines of Colorado Territory, then march west through Salt Lake City and occupy the seaports of San Diego and Los Angeles, California. General Sibley believed the native people of New Mexico, Utah, and California would join his Texans and swell his ranks as he advanced northward and westward. But General Sibley's plan would prove to be fatally flawed in the New Mexico campaign. While there are a few New Mexicans who favored the South, there was little actual support for the Confederacy within the territory. The famous frontiersman Kit Carson, a resident of northern New Mexico, tore down the rebel flag raised by Confederate sympathizers in Taos, nailed the Stars and Stripes to a pole, and hoisted it on Taos Plaza. He then dared anyone to tear down the flag of his country and set a guard to see that flew day and night. Further, Henry Sibley was a heavy drinker, being described later by his soldiers as, quote, a walking whiskey keg. The effect on his performance during the New Mexico campaign would seriously affect the entire venture and the lives of his men. Somehow he managed to miss every battle fought during the New Mexico campaign. Whiskey, rather than cowardice, was likely the immediate cause. In the end, Henry Hopkins Sibley was reputed as one of the Confederacy's worst generals. Now, I saw some things out in the lobby, and this is not a photobomb. I think I saw this movie maybe 4 times before I realized how many references there were to the Battle of Glorietta Pass or Glorieta. How many people have never seen this movie? Good, the bad, the ugly. Well, basically, Clint Eastwood, Eli Wallach, and their guy, Lee Van Cleef, are all looking for a guy named Bill Carson, a sergeant from the Confederacy that stolen $200,000 worth of Confederate coins, and they're all out to find him so they can steal it from him. So, anyway, there's a lot of references to that in the movie. Oh, I don't know. For example, at the 53-minute mark, Lee Van Cleef is in a makeshift hospital full of wounded Confederates. He then asks a wounded sergeant where he can find Bill Carson. The sergeant responds, if he is with the 3rd, they are already left for Glorieta. Canby's front line is right on their heels. Those poor devils with the desert ahead of them, I really doubt that any of them are still alive. I'm going to come back to that later on in this program. Okay, good now. All right. In July, Jefferson Davis made Sibley a brigadier general of the Confederate Army with command of the Department of New Mexico. He pointed out that he could spare no arms or munitions. The new brigadier would have to scrape together what he could and in Texas on its own and then make up the balance for equipment of enemy stores for the force he took as he marched upriver. Sibley returned to Texas where he recruited a brigade of 3 mounted regiments and set out for El Paso, the jump-off point of his campaign to control the Rio Grande. Last week, my wife and I were in El Paso and Jacinto Plaza. There is a monument that describes General Sibley gathering his troops there at that time in 1862. I'll point out a few things in this map. One is that you notice that there's the 34th parallel, and you Arizona say, hey, wait a minute. Well, New Mexico's not north of Arizona. Okay? So anyway, in 1858, the Arizona Territory was graded out from New Mexico territory, and they established Wasilla as their capital. Capital of New Mexico would be Santa Fe, and a dividing point would be the 34th parallel, and not the 109th meridian that you folks understand as being the separation of the states of New Mexico and Arizona. Now, as you know, New Mexico will become a state on January 6th, 1912, as the 47th state of the United States. And a month later, Arizona would follow suit on February 14th, 1912, as the 48th state in America. Now, two men, David Twiggs and John Baylor, had already done much for Henry Sibley while Sibley was at Richmond. Twiggs, a federal brigadier in command of the Texas Department during the secession furor, had repeatedly asked Washington for instructions. Receiving none, he surrendered all the troops, forts, and equipment in his charge. He left the U.S. Army and joined the Confederates in New Orleans as a major general. John Baylor would recruit and lead a regiment called the Texas Mounted Rifles. He marched then north, taking Bacilla, accepting the surrender of Major Isaac Lynn's 700-man garrison at Fort Fillmore. He would then march to El Paso in time to receive the surrender of Fort Bliss. Now, when Julian and I were at Fort Selden last week, we took a picture of a McClellan saddle. And in that, they described that the regiment at Company F of the Regiment of the Mounted Rifles in Fort Gilmer were one of the first to receive the McClellan saddle, even before many in the Eastern Theater had received them. That's an interesting fact. Baylor returned to Bacilla. On August 1st, issued a proclamation establishing the Confederate territory of Arizona at the 34th parallel as its northern boundary, and himself as its military governor. Such then was the situation that General Sibley found awaiting him when he reached Fort Bliss in mid-December his newly recruited brigade. Between them in a different way, Twiggs and Baylor accomplished much of this project of him already, supplying his men with surrendered equipment and clearing the Rio Grande beyond the Texas border. Now, let's look at this map. Show the whole map. Why is there only half a map?
There it is.
Huh?
We zoomed in
Oh,
so we
okay.
can see that area.
All right, so at any rate, it takes El Paso to the south. He would take over Fort Bliss, Bacilla, and Fort Thorne, you'll see on the map there. Fort Stanton off to the right. Fort Craig, south of Valverde. So basically, the line of march is this is very easy to understand. The line of march is north and south. Sibley would take his troops and follow the Rio Grande River all the way up to Santa Fe, through Albuquerque to Santa Fe, and then take an east-west route. And the battle would actually be east and west along Santa Fe Trail. And the objective point eventually be Fort Union, because the last stronghold of Union troops in the New Mexico territory. Incidentally, from Independence, Missouri to Santa Fe on the Santa Fe Trail is 1,203 miles. So, as we go north, and as you folks know this, you go from very arid, flat lands down here in Arizona, New Mexico, and as you go north up into Santa Fe, the terrain changes. It's very easy to move troops and artillery and infantry and cavalry when the land is flat, and you can move them very quickly, and you can see forever the enemy. But up in Santa Fe, that's the case. Now you're talking about high canyon walls, craters, boulders, rocks, the wagon ruts from the thousands of wagons that came on the Santa Fe Trail. The terrain will change to juniper trees, cedars, pinyons, and so forth, making it very, very difficult for the movement of infantry, the movement of artillery, and the movement of cavalry as they march east to west. So it's a north and south battle from Valverde on up until Santa Fe, and then it becomes an east-west battle with the Confederates fighting east and the Union troops fighting going west. Fort Stanton garrison had withdrawn to Albuquerque, while the Unionists at Fort Thorne, 50 miles above Bacilla, had retreated 80 miles upriver to Fort Craig. Incidentally, I digress here. Fort Stanton is very interesting. I found that there are a lot of Civil War generals or people who have been at Fort Stanton either before the war or after the war. Some of these would be Joseph E. Johnston, Richard Buell, Kit Carson, August Coots. Lew Wallace would write a couple chapters of Ben-Hur at Fort Stanton. And World War I hero John J. Pershing was also in command of Fort Stanton at one time. Okay. Fort Craig, which would now remain the only prepared defensive position in federal hands below the 34th boundary parallel. Once Fort Craig fell, the others to the north should fall like toppled blocks. Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Fort Union, eastward beyond the foothills of the Songbird to Crease Mountains. At Fort Craig, he knew 4,000 troops were preparing to move against him, but perhaps as many more in support beyond the parallel. He himself had 3,700 troops, including Baylor's. On February 7th, Sibley set out for Fort Craig, where the Federals were massing under Department Commander Colonel Edward R.S. Canby. The stage was set for the first major class to determine who would control the Rio Grande. Canby was Indian-born, tall, clean-shaven, soldier-looking, with a big nose that dominated his otherwise delicate features. Colonel Canby was a year younger than Sibley and had finished at West Point a year behind him. Thrust into command at the outbreak of his hostilities, he had about 1,000 territorial militia, poorly armed and trained to supplement the scattering of peacetime regulars stationed at various posts and forts in his department. Supplies were scarce and distances very vast. Consequently, while Baylor took Fort Bliss and then Fort Fillmore, Canby could do nothing but work with what he had in an attempt to strengthen his defenses. Meanwhile, sending out repeated calls for volunteers, by the end of the year, Canby had 5 regiments recruited by prominent New Mexicans, Kit Carson being one of these, and sent them out to bolster such remaining scattered strong points as not abandoned or surrendered or during the build-up. Okay. So again, we want to see the major clash that's going to occur here is Val Verde, and Fort Craig is just south of that. It's a very, very strong stronghold commanded by Colonel Edward R.S. Canby. Next picture. Next picture. This picture is one of my most interesting, not because of what you see, this is the Rio Grande, but how I got this picture. You can't get this picture, or you can break the wall like I did. It's actually behind an industrial park. And I wanted to go to Val Verde and see this so badly that when I got there, it was chained around the fence with links that said, no trespassing, do not enter, go away, that kind of thing. Well, when Julian wasn't looking, the gate was open. I snuck in my car back here and got this photo and snuck back out before anyone could see me. And in this picture, you can see the mesa behind us. It's going to come up in this story pretty soon, but this is the Rio Grande. Probably not at that time. It's probably been dredges then. So Canby expected a siege and then an attack. Instead, as light grew the next morning, he looked across the river and saw the enemy wagons rolling north. Sibley was bypassing the fort, leaving it and the Federals behind when he moved northward into the unprotected region that was Canby's primary assignment. Canby would have to attack without the advantage of his adobe fort's walls. Accordingly, he sent a regiment up the western bank under orders to cross the river 5 miles upstream and charge the rebels, who he believed were moving north across the mesa of Val Verde and March Cullum. Crashing through the reeds of the eastern bank, then charging up the slope onto the mesa, the Federals found the Texans awaiting with double-shotted guns. Cannon and rifle fire broke up the attack in short order. The blue troopers scattered for what little cover they could find. They clung there under sniper fire through what was left of daylight and withdrew after dark to report to their commander that the rebels were still there. At dawn the second day, Canby knew he had Sibley outnumbered, formed another attack. He sent 3 more regiments up to join the first with orders to force the crossing in strength and whip the rebels, who were still drawn up on the mesa within musket range of the river. After losing a good many men at the crossing, the bodies of men and horses floated slowly downstream. They managed to get their guns across and knock the enemy back. From there, the Texans tried cavalry charges against the flanks and dismounted charges against the center. Past midday, the charges continued. All were repulsed. Then at 2:45, Canby himself came up from the fort, bringing the remaining regiment. He assumed command, just as Colonel Tom Green on the Confederate side took over from Sibley, who had become indisposed. From the heat, some said, while others said it was from whiskey. Whichever it was the Confederate advantage, as Green was an all-out fighter. He put his cavalry up front, massing behind them all the dismounted men he could lay hands on, and sent them charging all together a 6-gun battery at the north end of the Federal line. For 8 minutes, one participant said the fighting was, quote, terrific beyond description. By then, Green's men were among the guns. The battery officers and Canadians were dead. When the Texans turned the Confederate captured piece against the line, they had certainly been part of it. It broke badly. One Confederate complained that the Northerners, in their haste to reach the west bank of the river, became more, quote, more like a herd of frightened Mustangs than men. Once again, there was a slaughter, the crossing of more bodies floating downstream. This monument on the bank of the Rio Grande of Valverde is made of Texas rose-colored granite, which is a native stone of Texas. If you ever go to the Confederate capital or the capital in Texas in Austin, their entire capital is basically made of this granite, and it is one of the most beautiful capitals I've seen in the United States. Canby asked for and received from Greene an armistice to bury the dead and care for the wounded. Canby's forces retired to the protection of Fort Craig, having lost 263 to Confederates 187. This opening phase of the campaign, seen in the Southwest as the base of operations farther west, had been accomplished. Ahead lay the chief cities of Albuquerque and Santa Fe. Sibley pressed on north without delay. These pictures are all taken in Albuquerque and Santa Fe. And there's a picture of the Santa Fe Trail, which we saw last week, Julian and I. Now I'm going to stop here. We couldn't find this monument last week because the obelisks have been torn down. You can't get this picture again because during the George Floyd insurrections, the people who wanted to tear down monuments, they tore down the obelisk. And they also smashed one of the panels that referred to attacks or battles against the Indians.
Sorry.
Although they met no opposition in either city, Sibley encountered a larger problem. The garrisons there fell back to Fort Union, but under Canby's orders had burned all provisions and equipment in their wake. Colonel Edward R. S. Canby knew this country and what it could do without an army, without supplies. Having tried to stand a fight at Valverde and having lost, he adopted a scorched earth policy. Sibley's men were already feeling the pinch. They received no sympathy from the people of Albuquerque or Santa Fe. Unlike the cheers and hurrahs they received from Southern sympathizers in lower regions of the initial campaign, these Texans found instead the atmosphere definitely unfriendly ever since they had crossed that 34th parallel. The Southern commander's prediction that troops of sympathizers would come in marching to join him, miners and trappers from Utah Territory and beyond, were not to be fulfilled. Rather the opposite, as groups were organized to join the Union side. Sibley was finding out that the only one with victory was miles and miles of desert. Still, he had done nearly all he set out to do in preparing a base for the conquest of the far west. All that remained was Fort Union, 60 miles east of Santa Fe. Fort Union had been the rallying point for all the garrisons Sibley had flashed from their posts. Well fortified and held in strength, he knew he would have to fight to take it. He prepared to do so by sending 600 men to the mouth of Apache Canyon, which led to Fort Union with orders to hold it from any federal advance. Once the main body came up, they would all go forward together to wipe out the final enemy stronghold. All right, so let's talk about the Glorieta. This is a two-day battle. On March 26th, there'll be a battle of Apache Canyon. You'll see in the far left here. And then on March 28th will be the Battle of Glorieta. The Confederates' base would be Johnson's Ranch. And as you go west and north and so forth around it, down to Kozlowski's Ranch would be the Union base. Also, Pigeon's Ranch would be almost where the Battle of Glorieta would occur. It is 11 miles from Johnson's Ranch to Kozlowski's Ranch and 5 miles from Pigeon's Ranch to Kozlowski's Ranch. Major John Shivington would do a flank attack that would go across to the Confederate camp later on this talk. While General Sibley remained in Albuquerque, the Confederates were led by Major Charles Pyron and Lieutenant Colonel William R. Scurry. Scurry was known as Dirty Shirt for his grimy clothes worn during a hard campaign for Texas secession early in the year. During the Apache Canyon Battle on March 26th, Pyron had his battalion of the 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles, 4 companies of the Texas Mounted Rifles under Major John Shropshire, and 2 cannons. Scurry's force included 9 companies of the 4th Texas Mounted Rifles, 5 companies of the 7th Texas Mounted Rifles, and 3 additional cannons. On March 26th, the picket spotted a column of 400 Union troopers. The Texans mounted up, rode forward, and formed their lines with what they believed was another drubbing of Union soldiers. This would not be the case. Suddenly, one wrote, his white Federal infantry, quote, were upon the hills on both sides of us, shooting us down as sheep. They had been sucked into an ambush. Falling back, they could see on the overhead ledges enemy sharpshooters, quote, jumping from rock to rock like mountain sheep. They were the Pikes Peakers for the Denver gold mines, the 1st Colorado, 1,342 volunteers with one battery of field guns and other mountain howitzers. In only 14 days, they had made a long 400-mile march to Fort Union, arriving on the same day that Sibley had pulled into Santa Fe. 5th Texas Private George Brower later wrote, quote, they were regular demons that iron and lead had no effect upon, in the shape of Pikes Peakers for the Denver City gold mines. Now, the Union force was led by Colonel John P. Slough of the 1st Colorado Infantry. John Slough was a prominent Denver lawyer, originally from Ohio. Slough commanded 9 companies of the 1st Colorado, a detachment of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd U.S. Cavalry regiments, and 2 artillery batteries. Major John Shivington commanded 5 companies of the 5th U.S. Infantry, 1 company of 1st Colorado, and John Hobart's independent company from the 2nd Colorado, and some New Mexican militiamen. Now, John Shivington was a very unusual choice as appointed as major by Slough. A true frontier character, the Reverend John Shivington of Denver, had been a Methodist missionary in Indiana Territory, and then he served as presiding elder of the Rocky Mountain District of the Methodist Episcopal Church since 1860. The Texans rallied and made a stand near the mouth of the canyon. Federal cavalry came up and attacked. The Texans broke and fled, but all 71 surrendered, bringing their casualties to 146, while the Coloradans only lost 19. In another potential capture, Union Private C.W. Logan of Company F found a wounded Confederate who called out to him from behind a rock that he was hurt and wished to surrender. When Logan loaded his gun and came up to disarm and aid the man, the rebel drew his own pistol and fired, hitting Logan in the arm. Quote, "Oh, you son of a bitch, I'll kill you now," Logan explained and put a bullet through the man's head. On March 28th, now this will be the second battle, the main bodies of both armies were moving through Apache Canyon from opposite directions. Now, if you're looking east, you're the Confederates looking east. If it comes up looking west, you're the Union looking west at the Confederates. On March 28th, the main bodies of both armies were moving through Apache Canyon from opposite directions. An hour before noon, they met at Glorietta Pass. Now, Glorietta Pass was a strategic location situated at the southern tip of the Sangre de Grey Mountains and on the Santa Fe Trail. The name Glorietta Pass is somewhat of a misnomer. The pass itself, the highest point on the Santa Fe Trail between Kozlowski's Ranch and Johnson's Ranch, lay midway along the road. Common usage, however, left the name to the outer stretch of trail as Glorietta Pass. Westward, 5 miles from Kozlowski's was the next way station, Pigeon's Ranch. The Santa Fe Trail continued another 2 miles to enter, then turned south and southwest to enter Apache Canyon. The trail then dropped down the steep-sided bed of canyon to Johnson's Ranch, some 4 miles from the pass. These 11 miles would define the limits of the fighting that would take place the next few days. Glorietta Pass was described by a northern lieutenant as, quote, a deep gorge with a narrow wagon track running along the bottom, the ground rising precipitously on each side, with huge boulders and clumps of stunted cedars interspersed. Maneuver was extremely difficult. Both forces would bang away at each other with rifle, pistol, and cannon fire. All right, let's put that. Now, what's happening here is they start this initial phase at 11 o'clock is that Colonel Scurry would take the artillery of both sides is on the Santa Fe Trail. They get a clear field of fire. The infantry then and cavalry have been off to the right and left. You can see this guy named Raquette up in the top right as you're looking at it. He would try to flank the Union Army on the Union Army's right, while Sharpshooter tried to flank the Union left over here in the left. And in the meantime, Scurry will then follow his Confederates and take on the center. Confederate Commander Scurry decided to attack. He had approximately 1,285 men to advance against the Federals, along with the 2-pounder guns and 2 12-pounder field howitzers. Expecting the Confederates to remain in Apache Canyon, Colonel Slough had sent Major Shivington with 2 infantry battalions on an encircling movement with orders to go hide out at Glorietta Pass, hit the Texans in the flank when Slough's men force had engaged their front. Again, we'll point out the map. Next one. Is this Slough, John Slough, from the Union Federal Commander, thinks that Scurry's going to stay at Johnson's ranch and regroup. He doesn't. He moves his forces out, and they meet the vanguard of the Union forces at Pigeon's Ranch. In the meantime, he sends John Shivington, his major of 488 men, to try to get into the rear of the flank of the Confederates over here at the Confederate camp at Johnson's Ranch. 488 men. Shivington did as ordered, and his men waited above the pass for Slough and their men to arrive. However, instead of remaining in Apache Canyon, as Slough had expected, Scurry advanced. Scurry believed the Union force was retreating to Fort Union. He intended to attack them until Colonel Greene could arrive. 1 6-pounder cannon and a small guard was left at Johnson's Ranch, while the rest of the Confederate force were 1,000 marched eastwards along the Santa Fe Trail. But Slough found the Texans so far forward, he launched an attack, hitting them about 11 a.m., some half a mile from Pigeon's Ranch, thus opening the Battle of Glorietta Pass. A provisional battalion of 4 companies from the 1st Colorado, supported by both batteries, was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Tappan, who deployed his men across the Santa Fe Trail. The Confederates dismounted and formed a line across the canyon. Tappan was initially successful and held his ground for half an hour, but the Confederates' numerical superiority enabled them to outflank Tappan's line by noon. The Union troops were thrown back in confusion, but managed to take up position around the Adobe Ranch buildings. Slough reformed his men several yards closer in order to attack the Union right, made a Shropshire the Union left, with the remainder led by Scurry against the Union center and the artillery firing in support. The attack of the Union left was beaten back, with Shropshire being killed. I want to point out another thing is that as the Union is getting pushed back during this battle, is that they will take care of their munition trains and so forth, keep them behind their lines and move them as they move farther back toward their home base at Kozlowski's Ranch. And you can see how this battle is being played out. At around 3 p.m., the Confederates outflanked the Union right, but Raquette was mortally wounded. It was obvious to Colonel Slough that his action in splitting his force and detaching 1/3 of it under Major Shivington was a serious mistake. With some 800 men opposed to almost 1,300 Confederates, he was at a considerable disadvantage as being pushed back. He sent a mounted officer to find Shivington and direct him to come quickly to his support of the main column. In the meantime, he set up an effective defensive line. From this ridge, thereafter known as Sharpshooter's Ridge, Confederate riflemen started picking off the artillerymen and infantry below them. Scurry again pressed this Union center, and Union position became untenable. Federal Colonel Slough reluctantly ordered a retreat. Slough reformed his line a half-mile east of Pigeon's Ranch, where skirmishing continued until dusk. Union men finally retreated first to Pigeon's Ranch and then to Kozlowski's Ranch, their base, leaving the Confederates in possession of the battlefield. The Federals had inflicted 123 casualties at a cost of 86. But this is not the end of the story or the battle. With the sounds of battle echoing in the distance, Lieutenant Colonel Manuel Chavez of the 2nd New Mexico Infantry informed Major Shivington that his scouts had located the Confederate supply train at Johnson's Ranch. Marching his men to 9 miles in 4.5 hours, Shivington and troops reached the western rim of Glorieta Mesa. The Federal commander had the soldiers march in, quote, perfect silence until we're almost directly on top of their heads on almost perpendicular mountain 1,500 feet high, one soldier recalled. Early that morning, Colonel Scurry made arrangements to protect the supply wagons he was leaving behind, along with his horse and mule teams. To guard it, Scurry detailed a 6-pounder gun atop the hill, commanding the Santa Fe Trail, as well as the wagon masters and teamsters and his sick and wounded men, 200 of them in all. Scurry undoubtedly thought such arrangements for securing his supplies, transportation, and non-combatants were sufficient, given the highly defensible nature of the camp and surrounding mountains. He had not personally experienced the aggressiveness of the Colorado Volunteers 2 days earlier, and the protection of his rear lacked serious attention. From the trailside camp, the heights south of Johnson's ranch appeared to be mountainous, ridge or top of range of mountains. In fact, this is an illusion. The apparent crest is instead the abrupt western edge of Glorieta Mesa, the flat top of which provides fairly easy passage to a point directly over the Confederate campsite. If Scurry gave little thought to position safety, some of his men were worried. Sergeant Petitolis wrote, quote, "Fearing nothing for our train, we left it behind and marched out to give battle." Another wrote, quote, "At Valverde, although we were hard pressed, yet continuous guard was kept with the train. For Shivington's men, the scene was too serene. Those who could peer below the hillside, Confederate breastworks thrown up the previous 2 days. A hospital could be recognized, sheltering approximately 80 casualties and sick. On top of the prominent hill south of Santa Fe Trail, a single 6-pounder gun pointed eastward toward Apache Canyon. Spread around the hill was the 80 wagons that Lieutenant Colonel Scurry had left behind when he marched eastward earlier that morning. 500 horses and mules, draft animals for the wagons, were penned into a natural corral at the foot of the hillside directly below Shivington. After launching his supply train for an hour, Shivington's 488-man force descended the slope and attacked, driving off or capturing the small guard with few casualties on either side. Private Gardner would remember that he and his companions all raised, quote, "the engine yell," and, quote, all managed to get down. As they did so, the Confederate cannoneers opened on them with that 6-pounder. They got off only 2 ineffective rounds. However, before being forced to abandon the gun due to the lack of draft animals to pull it and its limber. Sergeant Nettles spiked the gun by placing a musket ramrod in the touch hole in the breech and bending it. The brave sergeant then set fire to the nearby limber and its ammunition chest. The chest blew up before Nettles could run to safety, scorching him so he appeared to be literally burnt all over. Shivington's men then looted and burned 85 provision-laden supply wagons, either killing off or driving off 500 horses and mules before returning with their prisoners to Kozlowski's ranch. There was, quote, "a great deal of fine officers' clothing, fine Mexican blankets, all kinds of military stores, wines, brandies, pickles, canned fruit, oysters, Navy revolvers and double shotguns, etc." one soldier would recall. Orders were then made for the soldiers to distribute the kegs of powder in each wagon and fire them. When the fires reached the powder kegs, each wagon blew up. One already full of spare ammunition exploded with unexpected force, severely wounding Private Samuel Ritter of Company A. The men with their prisoners straggled back up the slopes east of Johnson's ranch, their labors made more bearable by the spectacle below them. Private Garner recalled that, quote, "before we reached the top, nearly every wagon had exploded, and sitting to rest upon the top, we witnessed every wagon with its contents, a smoldering heap of ruins." Maybe Shivington would write later, quote, "the wagons were all heavily loaded with ammunition, clothing, subsistence, and forage, all of which were burned upon the spot or rendered entirely useless." With the return of Shivington's party, the Battle of Glorieta was at an end. This would be the most important event of the campaign in New Mexico. 4 days later, April 2nd, the federal column reached Fort Union, ending the possibility of any further conflict with the Confederates. So, ladies and gentlemen, it looked to be a very glorious victory for the Confederates. Turned out to be a very inglorious and ignominious defeat. The Battle of Glorietta Pass can be seen as a clear federal tactical victory. Colonel Slaughter obtained his goal of obstructing the movements of and disrupted the supply of the enemy, as force still protected Fort Union. This is a picture of the Santa Fe Trail. Fort Union is still visible today. One of my favorite pictures here when you see it. If you go to Fort Union, you can still to this day See the wagon ruts of all those hundreds of thousands of wagons 160, 180 years ago that traveled the Santa Fe Pass, Santa Fe Trail. The wagon ruts are still there. With no supplies to sustain his advance, Colonel Scurry had to retreat to Santa Fe, the first step back on the road back to San Antonio, Texas. In addition to Yankees, the Texans would now be fighting thirst and starvation. Initially, the weather was quite cold, and many of the wounded in the Santa Fe hospital suffered from pneumonia. Bringing constant relief through her presence in the hospital was the Federal Colonel Canby's wife, Louisa. When some citizens objected to aiding the enemy, Mrs. Canby argued, quote, whether friend or foe, the wounded must be cared for. They are the sons of some dear mother. One Texan patient remembered, quote, how kindly she stooped over our wounded forms, how soft her touch, how kind her sweet voice. Mrs. Canby brought food and other necessities for the men, organized the other Union women, and continually caring for enemy casualties. Louisa Canby certainly won the hearts of all, many recalling many years later her kindness and remembering the humane acts of, quote, that grand Union woman, the wife of General E.R.S. Canby, the best and bravest general on the northern side. 4 days later, on April 1st, newly promoted Brigadier General now, Edward Canby left Fort Craig and followed Sibley's trail. Meeting him on April 8th at Albuquerque, Sibley was ready for him. They exchanged cannon fire, each called for reinforcements. The great winner-take-all of the Southwest seemed about to be fought in Albuquerque, but wasn't. The countryside was too poor to support Sibley's invading army. His artillery ammunition nearly exhausted, his wagon train destroyed. The inhabitants were hostile to him and his men, and the recruits he expected never came, or like the pipe peakers, they came against him. So the numerical odds were against him more than ever. This is well, I guess you can read that. This is one of our pictures that we took that we actually got enhanced, so you can read it for yourselves. But this is at Albuquerque, the sign here. There was one left thing for do for it with this ragged, ill-fed, weary army was get out of there and back to Texas. So back to the good, the bad, and the ugly. So at the 45-minute mark, I assume watching this movie, they're talking about Sibley's retreat from Albuquerque. Because a hotel owner looks out his swing doors to see the Confederate troops, a long line of cavalry followed by infantry, marching through town, possibly Albuquerque. He remarks to his wife, quote, this morning I heard the whole thing. They say Colonel Canby is closing in with his Northerners, and later tomorrow they'll be in the city. That's why these Southerners are getting out. As soon as these cowards hear of blue shirts, they're on the run. These rebels have no will to fight. They'll soon be finished. Look, see that one with the white beard sitting in the wagon? That's General Sibley. He looks dead. He's finally getting out of our hair. Rather than march in pursuit and bring the rebels to utter destruction, General Canby wanted no more fighting. He knew that this country Sibley was taking his men through was all desert. He wanted no part of it. He followed Sibley's army south, only to ensure if they left the territory, he was responsible for protection. It was one of the nightmare marches of all time. They began the 10-day trek with 5 days poor rations, including water. For miles, the brush and the undergrowth were so dense they had to cut and hack their way through with bowie knives and axes. They reached the Rio Grande with nothing but their guns and what they carried on their persons. From start to finish, since heading north at the opening of the year, they had suffered a total of 1,700 casualties. Some 500 of these fell or were captured in battle. Now the remaining 1,200 did not get back to Texas. A good part crumpled along the wayside during this last 100 miles. Sibley reached Fort Bliss in early May with what was left of his command, strung out for 50 miles behind him. Here on May 4th, he made his report to the Richmond government, a very disillusioned man. He would write this: except for its geographical position, the territory of New Mexico is not worth a quarter of the blood and treasure expended on its conquest. As a field of military operations, it possesses not a single element except in the multiplicity of its defensible positions. The indispensable element, food, cannot be relied on. 10 days later, he assembled 2,000 survivors on the parade ground, thanked them for their devotion. He continued to retreat to San Antonio, took leave of them, and they disbanded. All his high hopes had come to nothing, including the newly formed territory of Arizona, which had gone out of existence with his departure. As far as New Mexico and the far west were concerned, the Civil War was over. Thanks to John Shivington and his men, the Federals had turned a defeat into a strategic victory because of one very big tactical mistake committed by General Scurry. The Confederates abandoned their northern advance toward Fort Union, retreated 1,000 miles back to South Texas, never to return. The climax of the war in the far west and turning point of the war in the New Mexico territory was the Battle of Glorietta Pass, the Gettysburg of the West. In the end, the Battle of Glorieta Pass was consequential. First, despite the fact that the Confederates took the field, they were forced to retreat to Santa Fe due to the destruction of their supplies, eventually abandoning New Mexico territory. Second, the Battle of Glorieta fulfilled Sibley's plan to obtain its key objective, the capture of the federal base at Fort Union. That would have broken the federal resistance in New Mexico and compelled Union forces to retire both north of Raton Pass and back into Confederate territory. Now, I brought some copies of the maps, and John Taylor's going to pass them out, or I have them here. Do you want to pass this out, John?
I could do that. We're also going to do Q&A as soon as the program's over.
All right. Well, I mean, you know, when you hear Civil War programs, I say, whatever happened to these people after the Civil War? They became ignominiously detractors, or they became heroes. So let's talk about some of them. For example, Confederate Lieutenant Colonel William Scurry. He would get his own brigade, but then he would be killed at the 1864 Red River Campaign. Scurry County, Texas, is named for this Southern hero of Glorieta. Tom Green, again, he would be lead his cavalry against Union gunboats during the battles of Pleasant Hill, Louisiana. He would be killed by federal artillery. Tom Green, Texas, is named in his honor. But perhaps the most tragic victory is Henry Hopkins Sibley himself. The general led his brigade in southern Louisiana in early 1863, but due to low esteem which was held by Major General Richard Taylor, their old Confederate commander, Sibley was placed in charge of baggage trains during the retreat of Taylor's men from the Battle of Bisland. Sibley had blundered in almost every aspect of his duties during that action and subsequent Battle of Franklin. As a result, General Taylor preferred charges of disobedience of orders and unofficer-like conduct against General Sibley. Those charges resulted in a court-martial that found him not guilty, but nevertheless echoed Taylor's low opinion of his generalship. Henry Sibley never held another command during the Civil War. But after the war, believe it or not, Sibley found employment as a general in the Khedive of Egypt's army for a few years. However, by 1873, the Khedive, quote, fed up with his drunken incompetence, dismissed Sibley from his army. Returning to Fredericksburg, Virginia, the old frontier warrior died there in poverty and obscurity in 1866.
1886.
1886. Many of the Union officers who fought at Glorieta had subsequent careers as varied as those of their Confederate foes. The most famous of Colorado's volunteer soldiers is now Colonel John Shivington. After leaving New Mexico and visiting Washington, D.C. to have his regiment converted to a mounted unit, the colonel of the 1st Colorado Cavalry took over command of the District of Colorado in addition to his regiment. During 1863 and 1865, this fighting parson became heavily involved with territorial politics. He allied himself with Governor John Evans in an attempt to achieve statehood for Colorado. That accomplished, Shivington would seek election to the United States House of Representatives. An Indian war or a campaign appeared the most obvious way to gain the publicity and claim that would not only make statehood, but also his election a reality. On November 29, 1864, Colonel Shivington led a force consisting of part of the 1st Colorado Cavalry and all the 3rd Colorado Cavalry against the peaceful Cheyenne village of Black Kettle and Sand Creek, not far from Fort Lyon in southeastern Colorado. The infamous Sand Creek Massacre would forever blight Shivington's military career. John Slough returned to Colorado after Glorieta during the summer of 1862. He quickly made use of his political connections to the territory. He traveled to Washington August 25th, managed to have himself appointed Brigadier General of Volunteers. With his new rank, Slough served out the balance of the Civil War as the military governor of Alexandria, Virginia. He served with credit in administrative positions, sitting often on courts-martial and various commissions. Then serving as a member of the court that convicted Andersonville prison commander Henry Wirz and sentenced him to death at the end of the war. He was mustered out of the federal service during August 1865, but he also served as a pallbearer at President Abraham Lincoln's funeral. Slough had political connections that continued in the immediate post-war era. In 1866, he would return to New Mexico as Chief Justice of the Territory Supreme Court. One of Slough's first interests was the proper burial of the Union soldiers killed at Apache Canyon and Glorieta. The efforts of Slough and many others were the genesis of the Santa Fe National Cemetery, to which the Union dead was soon transferred for burial, following in 1895 by internment there of the Confederates who had earlier been buried at Santa Fe. Slough could not, however, remain aloof from territorial politics. During December of 1867, William Ryerson, a former Union officer and member of the legislature, introduced a motion of censure of Slough for alleged unprofessional conduct. Slough was infuriated, and when the two men met in the billiard room of Santa Fe's La Fonda Hotel on December 17th, they argued violently, whereupon Ryerson shot the unarmed Slough dead. The killer was later acquitted on plea of self-defense, and the victory of Glorieta would have no further effect on the future of New Mexico Territory. Colonel Gabriel Paul was commander of Fort Union. After Glorieta, he returned to the Eastern Theater of Battle, was commissioned Brigadier General of a brigade that participated in the battles of Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. On July 1st, going into action at the railroad cut in Gettysburg, a minie ball hit the General Paul in the head, passing through both eyes, and he was blinded. Though small in stature, great in heart, and mighty in valor, this old hero lived another 20 years, dying at age 75 in 1886. Edward R.S. Canby was promoted Brigadier General on March 31st, 1862. He went to the Eastern Theater. He commanded the federal troops in New York City during the draft riots that followed Gettysburg. He later commanded the Army and Department of the Gulf, attacking the fortifications of Mobile, Alabama, just as the Civil War ended. General Canby accompanied a peace commission to Northern California to settle grievances of the Modoc Indians. During the peace talk, 2 Indians shot and killed Canby with guns that they had hidden. Edward R.S. Canby would be the only general officer killed during the Indian Wars. Following his murder, his widow, Louisa Canby, refused to leave her bed for a week. The people of Portland were so grateful and devoted to her, they raised $5,000 as a gift to help supplement her modest widow's pension. Louisa would devote the last 16 years of her life to promoting the memory of her husband and his many achievements. When she died in 1889 at the age of 70, she was buried beside her husband in Indiana. Her will returned the $5,000 to the people of Portland. The people of New Mexico did not forget to honor those who sacrificed their lives. They erected this plaza in Santa Fe, a press monument that includes the following inscriptions. Erected by the people of New Mexico through legislature, blah, 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 Battle of the Canyon, Battle of Val Verde, and so forth. And like I said, you can't see this obelisk anymore because it was torn down by tourists during the George Floyd uprisings. The Glorieta Battlefield Preservation Society was successful in 1991, securing the preservation of the battlefield as a part of the National Park System. The story will show the Battle of Glorieta to have been the Gettysburg of the West. But that's up to you to decide. Is that really a true comparison of Glorieta with Gettysburg as the Gettysburg of the West? Or is it exaggeration? Now, I can argue both points of view. But if you don't ask me questions, I'm going to tell you the questions that other Civil Roundtables ask me that I didn't know the answers of, and I'll tell them the answers. So, anyway, it's time for questions.
All right, we're going with the order in which the hands are raised. We got one down in front. Give me a minute to get there. And Lynn, George Custer just called and said that Canby was not the only officer killed in the Indian Wars.
General officer. He was a general at the time. Kennedy was. Custer was a lieutenant colonel.
I wanted to ask about Slough. After the Confederate wagon train was burned and the animals were killed, did he return to Fort Union, or did he try to pursue the Confederates to Santa Fe and Albuquerque and out of the New Mexico territory?
They went back to Fort Union.
Okay.
Next question. We got one up there, unless I missed somebody.
So I'm curious if the term "you won the battle but lost the war" came from this skirmish. And secondly, when they got the supply train, were there spies or were there informants that told him where the supply train was to find it?
No, it was quite by accident. The whole point of John Shivington was Slough sending Shivington was to get in the rear in the flank of the Confederate Army, which he thought was still there at Johnson's Ranch, but they weren't there. They had marched forward to Apache Canyon and then met the Union force at Pigeon's Ranch, leaving the supply base there. So it was just by accident, really, that Shivington was able to find the supply base there and destroy it. But that was again part of the story. As I said before, as the Union was being pushed back, and they were being pushed back, it was almost a stand-up even fight. There were 1,388 Union against 1,385 Confederates. But when Slough sent Shivington's 488 men away, he's outnumbered. Okay, he sends someone out to go find him and bring him back because we're getting outnumbered. I'm getting crushed. Okay. But the whole point of this is that the Union protected their baggage train. As they were retreating back toward Kozlowski's ranch, their baggage train was also being moved back, but in close proximity being protected by the Union forces. Not so with the Confederates. They moved forward and left their baggage train 8 miles back. And then Shivington did his deeds.
Could you explain why they make this comparison to Gettysburg? This was only a 2-day battle for one thing, but it seems like an exaggeration. Can you enlighten us on that a little bit?
Well, I'll take the point of view that it's not an exaggeration first. And I think you make a lot of comparisons. Gettysburg's a 3-day battle. This also occurred over 3 days, even though it was a 2-day battle, 26, 27, 28. You make that kind of comparison. But the bottom line is this. It's often said that in the Civil War, that Gettysburg was the turning point of the war. All right? After Gettysburg, General Robert E. Lee never ever again attempts to invade the North. It's also, he has never ever wins another battle. Never again. So there's never an attempt in the West at Glorieta to recapture the gold fields that was the major objective of Jefferson Davis and William Hopkins Sibley. There's never another attempt to do that. Okay. Number two, I'm going to point out another thing. And sending Shivington's men away, 488 men away on his flank attack. Think of another thing. Like, where's General Stewart at Gettysburg? Where's Jeb Stewart? Okay. Lee sends scouts out to find Stewart. And finally says, we're back and fighting a battle here at Gettysburg. It's our second day. Where are you? All right. Stewart is caught between the lines. So you can make that kind of comparison too. That Shivington, Slough sent out a scout to bring Shivington back. Okay. Secondly and thirdly, I think the Battle of Gettysburg is this. You saw in this program that the flank attacks on the Union right and the Union left, and then the middle, the strength of the attack. In Gettysburg is the same thing. On day 2 and day 3, let's say day 2. The whole objective of General Lee is to put pressure on the flanks of the Union Army so that they find a soft spot on Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill. And they actually do that. Confederate General Wright does pierce the line, but he has no support. Lee thinks the same day that this is why Pig's charge happened and probably shouldn't have happened. Lee says this: I had results by putting pressure on the right and the left and setting the center. They are strengthening their right and their left on the points, and the center is weak, and that's why we're going to go forward. Now he finds out on day 3 that the Union Army has already recaptured Cobb's Hill, which reinforces his belief that the flanks on Little Round Top and on Cobb's Hill are the strongest positions, and that they're going to be weak in the center. It's not true.
I think there's a problem comparing it with Gettysburg, because the Glorieta, the whole New Mexico campaign was badly planned and supplied from the very start. Let's assume that Glorietta Pass, that Chivington doesn't take the supply train. How are you going to get the gold from those gold fields in Colorado back? Because remember, you still have to supply the 1,000 or so, or 800 or so soldiers. That, by the way, that's what the supply train was carrying out there. So you now have to resupply to get back. And if you're thinking that, well, if they did this and it was successful, and California's open, wonderful, California's open, but it's 2,000 miles from the East Coast, so anything that comes through California has to still get back that long distance.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard, it's hard to say. What if this hadn't happened? It's like what happened if Samuel Jackson had been in Gettysburg? Well, he wasn't there. We only go with what actually happened. But the bottom line is, if you want to think this forward, is if Sibley had been successful in his, I want to say Sibley, he was never there. He was in Albuquerque the whole time drinking or something, right? The Confederates had been successful. They still had to capture Fort Union, which is the strongest point of Union strength. Okay, so they still had to accomplish that. If that had been accomplished, would the Confederates then supply more troops and munitions? Probably to hold it. But yes, it's like any other battlefield. You go on the ifs, what's, and where. So, yeah.
Brad's forgetting that Blondie and Tuco would have showed up to haul the gold back to Texas. That was the plan all along. We got time for 2 more questions, and then we got to cut it off.
Yes, sir. First, I want to commend you and your wife for your coordination in accomplishing this presentation. I have to say that regardless of our best efforts, that would never happen in my house. Quite different. The question I have, though, the Sibley stove that you showed in the earlier part of the presentation, that looks like a relatively cumbersome piece of equipment. And since you've seen one, that was, I assume, have to be transported by wagon. There was no way that individuals could just use that.
Could you repeat that? I don't quite understand.
The Sibley stove looks like a pretty cumbersome piece of equipment.
Oh, you know what? That's part of my program. I forgot to read it. Thank you very much.
Because they caught tents on fire.
Yeah.
I came across a description of the Sibley stove by General Custer's wife, Libby. She would later write in 1885 a book called Boots and Saddles. And she would write this: in the spring of 1873, the 7th Cavalry was on the march from Kentucky to Fort Lincoln, North Dakota, for General Custer's new assignment. While north of Yankton, South Dakota, Libby Custer would write this, quote, "No campfire would burn, of course, in such a gale, but I remember thankfully the Sibley stove that we always carried. The saddler had cut a hole in the roof of the tent for the pipe and fastened zinc around it to make it safe from fire. I shall never think about a Sibley stove without gratitude, nor cease to wonder how simple an invention can be the means of such comfort. It is only a cone of sheet iron, open at the top and bottom. The broader part rests on the ground, while the little pipe fits on the top. The wood is put through a door cut in the side. Only bullets can be used, for the aperture is, of course, small. It requires almost constant attention to keep the insatiable little thing filled. But it never occurs to me, for half a dozen are huddled together to ask who shall be the fireman. and there is equal division of labor. The stove is so light and marching. The pipe is removed and the rope is run through the openings, which enables it to be tied underneath the wagon, beside the bucket, which is always suspended there to be used to water the horses. And that's Libby Custer's description of the Sibley stove.
Half a dozen times.
Do we have any more questions? Anybody?
Ours was stockaded.
Maybe on Sibley's service in Egypt or the size of a Sibley tent?
Actually, John, I was at a Civil War Roundtable in Cleveland, and a guy asked me a question I couldn't answer. I can answer it now. Because the question was this: was it really gold in Colorado? And yes, indeed, there was. The Glorieta Gold Rush of 1858 was the second largest in United States history. Over 100,000 people participated in the rush, known as, quote, the 59ers. A reference to 1859, the year the rush to Colorado peaked, were called Pike's Peak or Bust. Gregory Gulch in Central City mined the most gold, with Central City becoming known as, quote, as the richest square mile on earth. Just one part of Colorado, the Cripple Creek and Victor Mining District, produced over 500 mines and 21 million ounces of gold, more than the production of California and Alaska gold rushes combined. It's because of this gold that Congress established the Denver Mint on April 21st, 1862. A lot of this was 1.25 million ounces, where 60% was placer gold. Placer gold is a particular type of gold. It refers to a gold that's not on the surface of the earth, but is dislodged and removed by force with mining axes, other tools, or explosive. So, today, I'm going to ask you this. What is the top gold mining state in the United States? What is the top gold mining state in the United States today? Top gold mining.
We got one Alaska, we got one Nevada, we got one Arizona.
Give Nevada the grand prize, Nevada.
Nevada, of course. The Silver State is the largest gold miner. All right. Well, with that, let's put our hands together for Lynn. That was fantastic. Thank you very much.
I want to say that it was a very good presentation. I've been to many reenactments out around here in Southwest.
Yes.
I'm
Lynn Herman, yeah.
I'm with the First New Mexico.
Okay.
Company.